I'm going to pray and get us started. Lord, I thank you for today. I just thank you for this beautiful weather that we had. We get together and learn more about you. I pray that you would fill this room with your spirit and that we would just walk away from this knowing more about you and loving you even deeper. Pray all these things in your name.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, so this is the topic. Did ancient Israel believe in one God or many? And, well, the problem, one way of expressing this is Herbert Near. The religions of Judah and Israel were not monotheistic right from their beginnings, but were as polytheistic as the Canaanite religions of the late Bronze and Iron Age, which would be kind of the Old Testament period. And that's kind of the view. This is often more of a kind of academic question. You're probably more likely to encounter this in a university or something like that. But there's a lot of other people also who hold this view, that basically the belief in one God, whoever, sky God, whatever you want to call him, emerges, evolves out of sort of a belief in many different gods. And one of the things that got this going in the last 30 years was now almost 50 years ago. There are a few of us who remember the Six-Day War that Israel fought with the Arab countries round about it in 1967, I believe it was. And what happened was every country around them attacked them, and they kind of beat them back, fought it off. In the process of that, they acquired more land, some of which they still have, but one big piece of land was the Sinai between Egypt and Israel. They took that, and they held that until the Begin-Sadat Accords about 10 years later. During that time, they surveyed the whole of the Sinai, did a sort of archaeological excavations and work. One of the most important finds they found, and I'll talk more about this when we get to it here, but was an area in the northeastern side. It's only about 10 miles from the border with Israel, called Kuntilat Ajrud. And at that site, among other things, they found a number of inscriptions that were blessings from the 8th and 7th, from the 8th century BC, roughly the time of the monarchy, the Israelite monarchy. And they found these inscriptions that said, "I bless you to Yahweh and Asherah." So suddenly, Asherah, who's a goddess in the ancient Canaanite world, and Yahweh, who was the name used for the God of Israel, were connected. And there was not one, but there were two gods. And out of that, there grew this view that kind of resurged in the 1980s, that you've got lots of, everybody kind of believed at that time in several gods and goddesses, of which this was an example of it. And that kind of kicked the ball and got it rolling. And alongside of that is this other point, which is a suspicious view of any historical content in the Bible. So I will try to address them both. Now, there are different ways of dealing with this, which I always like to say, because these are not the ones I'm going to do. One is the philosophical way, kind of monotheism versus belief, Greek monotheism, and what does that look like, and what was Israel doing, and you talk about monolatry and belief in one God, which is technically the way they define a little bit more what Israel was, but there's a whole discussion about that. It's worthwhile, but that's not for tonight. Another way of looking at this is kind of in the theological realm, us versus them, monotheism versus polytheism, and how that emerges in terms of Israel and the countries round about it. We're going to look at comparison and contrasting things, God willing, but not quite in that way. What I'm going to do, God willing, is look at the extra-biblical. aspects of this. Look at what we can know. What did Israel and Judah believe? If for a minute you were to set aside the Bible and just look at the question of what do we know from the archaeology, from the extra biblical material, and so forth about what Israel actually believed, what would we come up with? What's different, the anomalies about it in comparison with other religions round about and its neighbors? And this is important. It makes it a little more selective, but the Bible uses its own methods of interpretation, and there's a lot of value in it. But the problem that you come with if you're talking with people about this in terms of the Bible is I can show you where in the Bible it says there's only one God. Very early on, Deuteronomy, for example, going back to the time of Moses, and it says, "Hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God." And only worship in Deuteronomy, that's 6, but Deuteronomy 5 and the Ten Commandments only have no other gods. And you can talk about that, but if you're talking to somebody who takes this view, they'll simply say, well, that was all written later. Somebody later took that and they rewrote the early texts and made them into what we now read. So there's no way, there's no way you can, let's put it, it's very hard to disprove that. I can make certain arguments about early dating for different things here and there, but if I'm looking at a theological point and somebody wants to believe a different one, how do you argue against that? Well, one of the ways to do that is to, for a moment, set aside the Bible and look at the evidence elsewhere. And what does that evidence say? If you were just going to go back or review all the archaeological and biblical evidence, and what does that mean? What does it look like? In fact, some years ago, here's my opportunity to make my advertisement. I wrote this book called Israelite Religions. And one of the main reasons I wrote this was actually intended as a textbook for this, but was to look at this very question and to look at, do we have any evidence like that? Now, obviously, I would answer yes, and I'll try to show you what that looks like, but that's what I want to do tonight. So this may be a bit of a different approach than what you often have or do, but hopefully it'll be interesting. So if we look at ancient Israel outside of the Bible, what do we know about it? Well, first of all, the first time Israel is mentioned outside of the Bible is in Egypt on this stela, which you can go to the Cairo Museum. They have a new museum now, great open, and it's better than the old warehouse sort of approach that they had before. But this is a Pharaoh Merneptah, back around 1209 BC, celebrated all his victories on this stela, and most all of it, like 90% of it, is in Africa, North Africa, Libya, fighting there and having victory down in what he called Nubia, fighting there and having victories. And the last 3 or 4 lines deal with Canaan and that area. And he mentions defeating a number of cities, Ashkelon along the seacoast, Gezer, and Yenoam, which actually may be in modern-day Jordan. But in between there, he mentions Israel. And there in 1209 BC is the first time Israel appears and is mentioned. And what's unusual about this is we have a whole lot of pharaohs before this who have itineraries about all their victories and so forth. None of them mention Israel. This one, which is one of the last actually, because their kingdom, their empire gets pushed out of Canaan and Asia. But this is the first time it's mentioned, which suggests something's going on. And it's mentioned as a people group. These others are mentioned as cities, but this is mentioned as a people group that appears. Right at the same time, the archaeology of Israel today and the hill country, which is like the spine that goes north to south down the center of Israel, and you can go up to the Jezreel Valley, up north, just sort of southwest of the Lake of the Sea of Galilee, and then go straight down to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, farther south, and you've got what is really hill country. That's the major hill area of what is the tribes of Benjamin in the south after Manasseh. And that whole area suddenly explodes in terms of population. And instead of maybe 24 sites before this, right around this time, you suddenly have 200 to 300 villages. And it's still counting. They haven't done everything. But what it shows is, in the final decades of Egyptian control, Israel is mentioned for the first time. And around 1200 BC, all these villages appear right where Israel is said to be. Look at, I cheat a little bit here because I will go back to the Bible just to point some things out. But look at Judges, at Ruth, at 1 Samuel. Where are the Israelites? There's a few like Jephthah and things that are across on the other side of the Jordan River. But a lot of them are in this area. That's where a lot of the scenes take place. Now, they'll go to, like, Samson goes down to Philistia and things like this. But he comes from this region where all of these villages and village life characterizes early Israel at this time. What I would call the period of the Judges after 1200 BC. So, Israel is a people. And this is where they are located at this beginning, and then they begin to spread out and fill out some of what really the book of Joshua has them allotted in these different areas. If you were walking around the hill country at this time and you encountered somebody, you wouldn't really be able to tell whether it was a Canaanite or an Israelite. They pretty much looked alike. And a lot of their practices were similar as well. So ethnically, there isn't a lot, but religiously, there is some difference that's going on already at this time. Okay, so I'll come back to that. And what about the other end? If that's the first part of Israel, where does it end? Well, we have records from Babylonian and Assyrian sources. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar is the most famous king of Babylon, who attacks and destroys Jerusalem ultimately in 586 BC and takes the people captive. That's the period of prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and others. Some Ezekiel in captivity, Jeremiah more in Jerusalem. But that's what's going on then. And he mentions doing that, or he mentions Israel, he mentions Jerusalem. He also mentions the countries round about it. To the west, the Philistines, Dor, Akko, and Tyre along the coast. To the east, Moab and Ammon and what is today modern day country of Jordan, across the Jordan River. So we've got Israel in between, so we know about where it is, we know when it begins, we know when it ends, and that without even consulting the Bible. We've got all this information. 1200 to 586 BC. Now, of course, there are events after that. Israel doesn't cease to exist. But this is the area we're interested in looking at. What do they believe? What can we learn about? So, one of the last great kings of Israel is Josiah. In around 622 BC, he has, according to the Bible, a big reformation. Now, his name is mentioned outside the Bible on a seal or two, but we don't know a whole lot about him. But he is regarded by many scholars who accept the idea of an evolutionary development from many gods to one god as the guy who brought it together, or maybe he didn't do it, like Near says, centralization, although ascribed to Josiah in 2 Kings 22. This program was only realized in post-exilic times, another 100 years later. It says in the Bible, Josiah found the book of the law, or someone found it, brought it to him, and he started a whole reformation, and then he would connect the book of the law with like Deuteronomy or something like that. But if you're not accepting that view, you simply say, well, that thing that they found, the book of the law, was actually a plant. It was put there in order to justify what Josiah wanted to do, which was to centralize everything with him at the top. So all the palace, all the power politically and everything comes to him, and all of the religion. He wants everybody worshiping at the temple next door to his palace. Well, it's kind of another story. But what that says then is that all of the earlier accounts in the Bible, Abraham, Moses, David, they did not know or believe in one God. It just wasn't around, it wasn't available, or it wasn't. Well, as I say, the issue is not whether Ezekiel and Jeremiah and others could see the temple and other people and widespread worship of different gods. Yes, all through this time, there were many Israelites who worshipped other gods. And we'll see that as we look at the extra biblical evidence. But the issue is there anything distinctive about Israelite religion? By this time, 622, 586 with the destruction of Jerusalem, from the extra biblical evidence that might point to belief in a single deity. So, this is what I want to look at, again, archaeological and extra biblical. The cult centers, where people worshipped, altars and things like this. Iconography, that's pictures. What did it look like? What was the art? And that often is connected with religious worship. Epigraphy, that is the writing. What did they write? What kind of text do we have that talk to us about religious belief in Israel and Judah outside the Bible? And then finally, the fancy word is onomastics. It's the personal names. Because we have lots of names outside the Bible, hundreds and hundreds of names on seals and seal impressions. And many of them are confessional names, confessing to God. 12 centuries. Around 1200 to 1000 BC, during the time of what you know of as the Judges, and the period after that, the rise of Saul and then David, there were places like this. This is in Shechem today, which lies right in the middle of the hill country. In fact, behind it, you see the modern Palestinian town of Nablus. But what you have there is actually a temple, the remains of a temple with a little standing stone in the middle. Standing stones were used often for worshiping particular gods. That temple, by the way, is probably the one mentioned in Judges 9 that's connected with Abimelech. But it's right there at Shechem, and it's part of the remains. What that is that at this time, that's a Canaanite temple. What you see is lots of investment in effort, big structures, and remains. Meanwhile, Israel itself, time of the Judges, time for Samuel, is composed of small villages. That's where the life takes place, the village sites all around the hill country. This is a reconstruction at Haifa University of what a village might have looked like. As I say, there are several hundred of these that have been identified. One thing you'll notice about this is that the houses, these are individual houses, they're a particular structure, they're well known for this period. They're all about the same size, because when early Israel settles, all the evidence we have in and outside the Bible is that it was egalitarian is probably too strong and a misleading of a statement, but it's going in that direction. And in fact, that's what you have. No king in Israel in the early period. Israelite villages may have a standing stone here or there, memorializing things. You know, Joshua sets up a stone in Gilgal. They set up 12 stones when they crossed the Jordan River, this sort of thing. And some distinctive vessels, but they don't have what the Canaanite centers have. Big investment in large buildings, specialized architecture, jewelry, cult items. I'll show you some of those. Israel has a simpler culture, and it has very few, no images of gods and goddesses and other cultic items. There are two exceptions to that which are very important. One is the so-called bull site east of Dothan. This is a bronze bull. It's about this size by this size. You can see it in the Israel Museum. It's in the middle of what was discovered as a kind of oval-shaped area, just marked off by stones. It's no walls or anything. And one standing stone. Bull figurine, this kind of artwork is found up north. It goes up right north through Hatzor in Syria and beyond. What is it? You don't know. It doesn't have a little sign telling you what it is. So it could be it could be a Canaanite god. It could be El. It could be Baal. Obviously, it's a male deity. It could be Yahweh, because we know that Yahweh was worshipped in other forms sometimes. We just don't know. So all we know is that it's there. The other evidence of religion in earliest Israel, archaeologically, is this interesting site on Mount Ebal. Have you heard of, how many people have heard of Mount Ebal? Anyone? Do you know anything about it? Anything from the Bible?
Wasn't it that one in like Deuteronomy where they have the blessings and the curses?
Yeah. Mount Ebal's right there where I showed you that Shechem site. Shechem sits right in the valley between Mount Ebal to the north, which is the tallest mountain in that area. In fact, today, if you go up there, there's an Israeli communication military center at the top. And then to the south is Mount Gerizim. Mount Ebal is the mountain of curses, where the curses are proclaimed. Mount Gerizim is the Mount of Blessing traditionally, so there's lots of churches there and other things that were built there. That's where the Samaritans still meet today and have their Passover. But Mount Ebal is barren. The entire mountain has been walked and examined, and there's not a single piece of evidence of habitation on that, with this exception. The third highest peak on Mount Ebal is this little guy. Looks kind of like a structure of some sort. It actually, and this is the only one between 3000 and 586 BC. Near a ridge, close to the top, surrounded by a stone wall. 2 levels, 1250 to 1200, it was pretty much just an ash pit sometime during that time. And then from 1200 to 1150, invaded by Egyptian scarabs, a little bit more. About 2,800 animal bones there. Mainly cattle, that means sheep, goats, as well as cattle, were found here. The kind of animals that people like Israelites would have herded, kind of animals that could have been used for sacrifice, probably that's what this was. This is an installation with ashes and bones. And so it raises the question, was this in fact used for sacrifice? This is the excavator's reconstruction of it. Of not steps going up to the altar, but that's a ramp, which you can walk, it's big enough, it's hard to get a sense of the size, and you walk around it at the top and offer sacrifices. Notice there are no cut stones, they're all field stones. Very interesting things going on here. This is Israelite within the time of this settling. No change in culture, no figurines, no votive offerings, no standing stones. Nothing that characterizes cult sites of this time in Canaan. Very non-Canaanite, which is why a lot of people had a lot of trouble ever accepting that this could be a cult site. Some people thought, it's a farmhouse, maybe some guy wanted to live alone, moved up there, away from everybody else. But you don't have the animal bone distribution that you would expect for a farmhouse. You don't have the donkey bones there and things like this. And implements that would characterize a farmhouse. Could it be a watchtower? But it's actually not on the ridge. If you go up there, it's about 10 to 15 feet off the ridge. So it's not where you expect a watchtower. And then what are they watching? I mean, if you have people coming up the hills, who are you going to tell? Because there's nobody living in that whole mountain. And so it raises questions there. It is atypical. It's distant from agricultural land. And the altar is unusual. Earth-fill altar raises a lot of questions. But what if you had a people who believed that they shouldn't cut stones for their altars? What if you had a people who believed that they shouldn't have steps going up to the altar? Much like is exactly what it says. It's when it talks about building an altar in Exodus 20. It says, don't make steps to go up that altar, and then again and again, don't cut your stones. just gathered them up. No altar like this in Canaan. Something different was going on here. And it's one altar. It's not multiple altars. One altar tends to mean one God. You're sacrificing to one God, not to many. A couple altars, you may have several gods. Now, as we go on in time, a couple hundred years later, we come to different structures in Israel. So population shifts into fortified towns, and up here in Dan in the north, you have an important site similar to other sites. This works well with Jeroboam the First. You have this area, a high place right at the side of Dan, but you here the stones are cut. In fact, they're cut in a special way. It's actually what they call earthquake architecture, because you've got wood in between the stones and things like this to stabilize it due to the tectonic activity in this area. But this is different, and it may suggest a slightly different religious practice, very similar to what we read about Jeroboam the First when he splits off and says, "I'm building put a gold calf up here, and at Bethel, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." And then go south, way south, down to Arad, near the sort of border with the Judean desert, goes south of there. There's a fort there from Israelite times. Like Dan, this is a big center or shrine, public, three-part structure. Interesting. The outer court out here, and then the inner court, and then a couple steps in what some have called a Holy of Holies. Interesting, this three-part structure, similar to maybe the temple in Jerusalem, but not somewhat different. You have two incense altars there, a big one and a small one. Does that mean there were two deities worshipped here at certain times? Don't know. But you do also have, like at Ebal, the altar on the outside is uncut stone. It's field stone. And again, Exodus 20 says, "If you make an altar of stones for me, do not build it with dressed stones." And these are very unusual, this kind of worship. It says something is going on in Israel that's different. Now, if we go a little bit later, towards the end of the period we're looking at, we have a temple near Jerusalem called Tel Motza, or at least a cult center. What's this thing? It's got figurines of all different sorts there. Is this an example of a high place? Well, very possibly. The books of Kings talk about where people worshipped their gods. Okay, now I go to the pictures, the iconography. The iconography is very interesting. This is from the 13th century BC. This guy could well be Baal. He may be holding a weapon that has long since disappeared. He was not BC, he did. And you have figurines like this. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about different figurines. Was he worshipped? I don't know. Is it just simply a model? Well, here at Lachish, west of Jerusalem, they also found a temple there, a Canaanite temple. And this is one of the nicer pieces from there. This is a goddess standing upon a horse holding two lotus flowers, which represent sort of fertility and growth, things like this, out of Egypt. This is probably Asherah, possibly Astarte, from around 13th century BC. And this is gold foil that this was found drawn on as it is. So clearly, in Canaanite worship, there were actual figures, figurines and other things going on and being used for worship. What about in Israel? Because these are a little bit outside of Israel. Well, I want to look at three items in sequence. A cult stand from Tanakh, the Kuntilat Ajrud, which I mentioned before, Yahweh and Asherah, and the pillar figurines, which are the latest, all through this period. So the earliest, we go back to the period of Solomon and David, if we were looking at it biblically, when they're taking over different areas. And what you have is, as time goes on, less anthropomorphic stuff like these figurines that we saw, more symbols, but you still have like the tree and the lion to symbolize the goddess, Asherah or Astarte sometimes. Tanakh cult stand. This is the cult stand. And this was found by Paul Lapp in the 60s, I believe, when it was excavated, when Tanakh. Tanakh is a site next to Megiddo, up there in the Jezreel Valley. It was a major Canaanite city. But if you're in a Canaanite city and say you're being taken over by Israelites, and what are you doing? And so you wind up with this kind of mixture which has a certain syncretism to it. This is a good example. Okay, so in the front of this is a cult. What a cult stands for? Well, there's a lot of discussion. You could maybe burn incense on top. You could maybe put fire in it, light it up. That would look nice. But this one is really specially designed. There's 4 panels in the front going up, and each one has a design on it. So the bottom one has a female figure with lions on either side. Now the lions associate this very nicely with the goddess Asherah. Keep that in mind. The second one, as we move up, has what, if you were an ancient Israelite, you would call 2 cherubim on either side. If you were from Egypt, you'd call them, well, I don't know what you call them, but today we call them sphinxes, because that's the kind of figure they are. And it's sort of animal made up of different parts. Wings, lion, human, all of that. But look at this. You have 2 cherubim on either side, and in the middle you have an empty space. Very interesting. Very interesting. And you can look at that as people have done, and today it's in the Israel Museum. You can spend all the time you want. But you can look at it, and in that one, you'll see it's not like there's a little spot there where somebody punched out something that was there, and the piece, part of it still remains where it was connected. There's nothing connected. That was originally an empty space. It always was an empty space. What could that be? 2 cherubim on either side and an empty, no figurine in the middle. Almost like the most holy place in the temple. Surrounded by cherubim with a imageless figure. And you have the ark, of course, there, but the ark is either the footstool or possibly the throne. Different views, but it's beside the point. There's no image of this deity. Very interesting. Go up another space, and you've got 2 lions again with ibex on either side, which are always nice animals. And right in the middle, you have this tree of life, a tree that represents fertility. Asherah, the goddess, is represented. Her symbol, one of her symbols, is a tree. So that's interesting. And actually, there's one down here. The human, or the anthropomorphic figure, and then the actual figure of the symbol. Go up one more, and you've got either, and there's been discussion about this, they've had zoologists examine this, so I don't claim to be one, but that's either a horse or a calf. If it's a calf, it fits really interestingly, of course, with the calves that Jeroboam set up. And Dan and Bethel said, these are your gods, O Israel. Go and worship them. If it's a horse, it kind of brings to mind what happens later when Josiah is clearing out the temple and removes the horses that were put in there, or the images of horses for worship. And then there's a sun disk that sits on top of that. That's all. This is about this tall. It's good size, yeah. But it's not, impossibly huge. Sort of terracotta type figures here. But really the best designed of them all. But what you have is Asherah, Yahweh. Asherah symbol, Yahweh symbol. You have this repeating, really a kind of poetic structure. It's sort of interesting. This is where I'm explaining this. I already did that. So you have clearly here, I think, an example of what was going on among some people in ancient Israel, especially people who were already had Canaanite background and weren't fully persuaded of just belief in one God. And so what you've got is what we call ABAB parallelism. Asherah, Yahweh, Asherah, Yahweh. And you have that in Psalms, you have that in poetry again and again where the lines are set up like that. So it goes back and forth and alternates AB, AB. This is what most of the cult stands look like. This is another one from Tanakh, but you can hardly see anything. It's a few images of lions, again some ibex and a tree, but it's Asherah. But it's just it's not nearly as nice. That one is amazing in terms of the artwork. But you see here an example of people worshiping both Yahweh and another deity or god. Now let's go down to this northeastern Sinai site of Mentilat Ashrud, which probably was a caravanserai, like an overnight place to stay when you were traveling on the roads through there, and you could find safety there rather than being out, being robbed by Bedouin, Amalekites, who knows what. But there's a whole room set aside for devotion to deities and things like this. And you have this imagery. It's probably the most famous of some potsherds that was, and this is sort of a copy of it. So there's a lot of things going on here, but you have two figures here, which are interesting, and a lyre player behind them. And what are they? And there's a lot of discussion about this. They have sort of bovine faces and feet, feathered headdresses, dots, which may be their apparel. A lyre player. Well, some people have suggested these are attempts to draw images of Yahweh and Asherah, because right above it, it says, I bless you to Yahweh and Asherah. In an inscription from around 800 BC. Others have seen in these figures a well-known Egyptian dwarf deity whose image is found all over this area, called Hess, kind of a good luck charm that was used. Or that Hess is somehow a symbol for Yahweh and the lyre player is Asherah. A lot of discussion. Don't have any parallels, really hard to determine it. But I show you this because there's a lot going on in the imagery. And what is it? Could it be Yahweh and Asherah? Again, could we have some syncretism going on here? Yeah, I think so. But we have evidence both of worship of Yahweh alone, that one God, and we have also evidence of worship of multiple gods. This is the last iconography piece I want to show you. These are called pillar figurines. They're female. There are hundreds of these. They are found in the period between around 700 BC after the fall of the northern kingdom, found only in Judah and Jerusalem to its destruction in 586 BC. And if you plot out where they're found, several hundred are found in and around Jerusalem. Plot out where they're found, you basically get a map of the area of Judah. It's not really outside of Judah, it's within Judah. So what are these? They're found in domestic sites. Some are very simple, with the head is just a pinch of clay, making the nose. Others are more cleverly done, female, prominent breasts. And so this has created a lot of discussion. They're made of clay. There's no special metal. So they're made fairly cheaply in domestic contexts. And so this, people have suggested, well, are these what they call prayers in clay? People praying for the process of birth, children, for lactation, and for the children being healthy, possibly. So this is outside of family piety. Others say, no, these are goddesses. It's kind of a cheap way to make a goddess, though. And you wouldn't expect it. So not so clear that that would be the case, but it's not unknown. So again, different discussions. And this is one of the problems when you don't have inscriptions. But we do have inscriptions, so I want to talk about inscriptions now for a while. A lot of inscriptions, especially as we go later in this period. Let's go back early to the Mesha stele. Now, you can read about King Mesha, king of Moab, in 2 Kings, chapter 1 and 2 and 3. He fights Israel. There he's defeated. Here he claims to have victory. It's a different battle, apparently. But he writes this. It dates from the 9th century BC, pretty early. He mentions the house of Omri. Omri was the father of Ahab. You may know him. He's a better known guy. And Mesha would have lived during that time. But in our interest isn't so much with the story of the battle. It's much more that he mentions capturing an Israelite city and drawing from it what's called an altar hearth, R-A-L, an altar hearth of Yahweh. That's really interesting because it says a lot of things. First of all, unlike almost every other place where he would have captured the main cult center, he doesn't take an image. There's no image. There's no statue. There's only something associated with this God of Israel known Yahweh. And this is the first mention of the God of Israel as Yahweh outside of the Bible. So at least from the 9th century, Israel was worshiping Yahweh. And it's only Yahweh. It's not Yahweh and Asherah, Yahweh and Baal, various. It's only Yahweh. Mesha, the king of Moab, knows only of one God associated with Israel, officially in any capacity like that. This is kind of interesting in its own right. A few decades later, a little site in the middle of the Jordan Valley, Jordan River, on the side of Jordan, the east side, a site called Der Allah, and there is some plaster fragments which would fall into the ground. They put them back up and pasted them up. And they read here the story of Balaam, son of Beor, and a vision that he had. Now this is hundreds of years after the Balaam of Numbers 21, but it's the same Balaam. Right? That many people call Balaam, and especially son of Beor. And he mentions a vision of El. He mentions a vision of the Shaddayim, which seems to be a council of a divine council of gods or of angel-type figures. The Bible doesn't tell us about Shaddayim, but it does tell us about El Shaddai. And that may be, as a number of people have suggested, that means El of, or God of the hosts of the armies. And this would be an example of that. Divine council. Well, again, we go to Kuntilat Ajrud in the inscriptions there. Those inscriptions mention Yahweh, they mention Asherah, they mention El, they mention Baal. A lot of different figures around 800 BC. Baal is associated with war. Yahweh is the most frequently mentioned. Yahweh is associated with Asherah. And also it's Yahweh of Taman in the south. Yahweh of Samaria in the north, in northern Israel. So he's associated with both with Israel in the north and a region in the southern desert, has a female consort, Asherah, and they can bless one another because the text says, I bless you to Yahweh and Asherah. Interesting. Now let's go on to another inscription. This is more debated whether it's a inscription or not, but Jerusalem, they found a pomegranate that's only about this size, it's very small, and has a hole under it, so it would be used to put a rod underneath, and it would be used in the temple as one of the implements used in the ceremonies and things like this by the priests. Maybe 800 BC. And around it you can see is writing, Old Hebrew writing. It says, part of it's missing, but it's pretty certain about the reconstruction, belonging to the temple of Yahweh, holy to the priests. So this is a mention only of Yahweh and to him. Kibbutz Kom, another site in Judah, mentions Yahweh, but also Asherah. But that's it. You got Kuntilat Ajrud around 800 BC and Kibbutz Kom around 800 BC. And after that, all the inscriptions mention only one God, Yahweh. Mikneyahu, servant of Yahweh. And as I said before that, in the 9th century, you've got Mesha, knows only of Yahweh. No other deities are mentioned on seals. And in Gedi, along the Dead Sea, where David sought refuge from around 700 BC, Yahweh is blessed. There's an inscription there. He's the ruler of nations. He's called my Lord. epithet of Yahweh. At Kerbet Beit Lai, another site in Judah, you also have Yahweh. He's mentioned as sovereign over Jerusalem from around 700 BC. He's mentioned, and there's a request for Yahweh, the Lord of Judah, to absolve, to forgive sins. And then you have these ostraca from two sites, dozens of them, and more. From to the west of Jerusalem, Lachish, which is one of the fortresses that guarded the western approaches to Jerusalem, the main one. And then to the south of Jerusalem, we already saw that place called Arad, where they also, which was also a fort. And this one has a number of writing like this from around 600 BC down to the destruction. What this is this is potsherds, and that was kind of the official correspondence. And they just wrote on it using ink, and they sent this back and forth to the leader in Jerusalem, whoever the general was, to inform them of what was going on and what things looked like in terms of, you even have descriptions of the Babylonian army approaching and things like this. But religiously, there are many that start like this. May Yahweh cause whoever the person is to hear tidings of peace and good. So this is simply an opening that's a blessing. God bless you. But it's always Yahweh, no other God. And then you have in one of these, number 5, it says, may Yahweh show you a successful harvest. So Yahweh is the one who you appeal to for the harvest. He's the one who brings food. He's the one who brings fertility. And the same way with Arad in the south, you have these things, they're called ostraca, Yahweh blessings. And then, finally, I have this there's this very interesting text that was found in 1979. They were excavating near Jerusalem. If you go to Jerusalem, the old city sits on a hill. And then as you go west of Jerusalem, you go down in what's called the Hinnom Valley. And you come up on the other side, and it's not that big in the area. In fact, they do concerts. And you come up on the other side. The other side has houses and things like this. Now, one of those is the Scottish Presbyterian Church. And on that site, there's some old tombs going back to 600 BC. And they were excavating those, and by accident, actually, the kid was jumping up and down, fell through, it was a false floor. He was okay. Actually became a fighter pilot later on. But this was in 79, and he fell through, and underneath he found some things, including 2 tiny little silver scrolls. When you look at them, they look very much like egg rolls, all rolled up. They were unrolled very carefully. Of course, the edges were all destroyed, but the text was right in the middle. And the text was a direct quote from Numbers 6, 24 to 26. 600 BC, this tomb was probably the thing was written, the 2 scrolls were written around 650. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you, be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance unto you and give you peace. Blessing of Aaron. And possibly also some words from Deuteronomy 7:9. But the point is, it mentions covenant, it mentions Yahweh, it mentions the covenantal love of Yahweh called Christi. Deliverance, it mentions the evil to be delivered from. It mentions God as one who is the rock, who helps. All kinds of things here in this text. It's the oldest biblical text, 2 of them, in the world. Nothing comes even nearer 600 BC. The next oldest biblical texts are from around 200 BC. So there's nothing for 400 years in terms of what we have. The only reason these are preserved, a virus disintegrates in that kind of climate. The only reason these are preserved is because they're scratched on silver. And silver. All identify only Yahweh as deity. Only Yahweh blesses others. Only Yahweh, as we saw, is the source of fertility and faithfulness. Only Yahweh provides deliverance from the evil. Has covenantal love. is a rock, is a helper. No other deity is named or suggested. The deities, Asherah, Baal, El, and a group of Shadaim are mentioned, but they are mentioned at Kuntilat Ajrud, kind of where people are scratching various beliefs and ideas coming from all kinds of different backgrounds. Elsewhere, Yahweh is dominant and the only deity. Mesha mentions only Yahweh. The outsiders, like the king of Moab, knows only that as the God of Israel. And only he is associated with cult objects. He is alone appealed to for blessing, for absolution, for reign over Jerusalem, Judah. And after the 7th century, no other God is mentioned in the inscriptions. So, this is another way of saying the same thing. So we'll go back over. Now we'll move on to the 4th category, which is the term onomastics, which is names. We have over 1,700. This is a seal, a famous seal. It has the name Jezebel on it. Probably isn't Jezebel, but who knows. And then you have what are called bullae. Bullae are simply where they take the seal and they push it into the wax, or actually the clay. So when you have a document and you've written the document, you rolled it up because it's papyrus or vellum, and you rolled it up like a tiny little scroll, then you want to seal it. Put clay or wax on it, and you put your seal on it. It's your mark. And it normally has, especially from the 8th century on, its personal names. It's the name of the person and often their father, called the patron. Okay, now, a name in ancient Israel usually means something. Some names only mean one thing, like Caleb is dog, Tamar is deer, that sort of thing. But you also have names that are confessional names made up of multiple elements. Hezekiah, Yahweh, it ends, that Yah on the end is a shortened form of the divine name Yahweh. Yahweh is strength, or my strength. Josiah, Yahweh is my salvation. Nehemiah, Yahweh is comfort. All of these are what they call confessional names, and the name Yahweh appears on them. So you've got lots of names, hundreds of them, and 46% of these names have Yahweh on them from all through this period, but especially towards the end. 6% have El on them. Now, El can be, there was a god named El back in the Canaanite times, the 13th century. Could be, but it could also just be a way of saying God. El, Samuel. God is, it means name of God. The one who is close to God and represents God, like the name El. And less than 1% are other deities, which is very small. And that could even be people who visited and dropped their seal or whatever they had. So it doesn't tell us a whole lot, but it's very small. Israel and Judah is Yahwistic, just right across the board. There is one exception, and that exception itself is a minority alternative. In the 8th century BC, in Samaria, in the capital of the northern kingdom, there are a number of ostraca with names, including several names with Baal. Now, the problem with Baal is like with El. It could be Baal, it could be simply Lord. Yahweh calls himself, he says, I bailed it over Israel. In terms of Hosea, I lorded it over you. But it could also be the God. We usually don't know. In the Bible, this period was a period when Amos and Hosea were writing against the false religion and the injustice of Israel at Samaria. So no surprise, that's exactly when you would expect to have Baal names there. And you do. But what's interesting is, as you look at the epithets associated with Yahweh in these names, first of all, there are no sexual allusions. The reproductive is connected with Yahweh. He is completely removed from that. No consort to Yahweh. Yahweh and his Asherah. Almost no animal names. There's one animal name, and it's a wonderful name. It's Egel Yah, which is, Egel means calf. And it's like this name is, I am the calf of Yahweh. I'm the one who is sacrificed and given to him. It's very different from a lot of animal names where you would say, yes, I am Yahweh. Yahweh is a fox or something like this. But that's not that. It had almost no identification with architecture, cities, or sky phenomena like stars and other things. No harming. Yahweh never harms. He never seeks vengeance. Instead, as the names have been studied, they evidence qualities of mercy, love, joy, and perhaps salvation in a unique extent that you don't find in the names of other cultures around about their gods. In the earlier period before Israel, before 1200 BC, you have El, you have Baal, you have Asherah in the names, and others of gods and goddesses we don't have preserved in the Bible, like Keba. No Yahweh names. Yahweh doesn't exist in those names. But you come to the time of Israel, you've got a dominance of Yahweh names. And when you compare this, it's very interesting because you can compare this with other cultures round about and their naming practices. So you look at Ammon, the Ammonites across the river, Jordan, Ammon today, the capital of modern-day Jordan. Ammon is also the capital of the ancient Ammonite kingdom. Has lots of names, so we can make some statistical analysis. Milcom is the chief god of Ammon. He appears in only 9 names. El, on the other hand, appears in 150 names. By far dominant, so much so that some people tried to argue that El was the official name of the god of Ammon. But Milcom is the only one that appears in their mythology texts and elsewhere, so it's hard. Baal appears in 2 names. Gad in 3. Mot, the god of death, in 1. It'd be hard to be called death. Mur is an Egyptian name of a god. And Yahweh even appears in a couple of names. Are these Israelites over there? Or are they simply people who have moved, like Ruth did? I don't know. But what we see is all of these different names. You don't have that dominance of the chief god, Milcom, in the names. You can contrast that with also, you can compare Edom, Moab, Phoenicia, Philistia with Israel. The Yahwistic names have a much larger dominance in Israel than any single name of a god or goddess in the names in the surrounding countries. Something special is going on in Israel on the basis of the names. That's got a lot of names. So it's very hard to, if you're looking for statistics, this is the place you come down to. Even if you study the major archives in Israel and Judah, again, the Samaria one I already mentioned, and then there's a couple from Judah and Jerusalem as well. In Samaria, 12% are Baal names, but everywhere else, it's less than 2%, often less than 1%, are any other name other than Yahweh where a god is mentioned. Although names alone do not prove a case, they contribute to the understanding. In the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the only period when Judah has significant name evidence, the public recognition of Yahweh in Israel and Judah's naming of their children reached an exclusive level that has no parallel among the surrounding nations. The evidence from these names adds to that of the Mesha stela, the correspondence at Arad and Lachish, the Ketaphenone silver strips, the Jerusalem pomegranate, the Getty inscription, and the Kerbet Beit Lai text that know only of Yahweh and know of specific characteristics of Yahweh. To this could be added the earth-filled altar at Arad and Ebal, which go back even earlier, and the absence of any clearly attested image of Yahweh. So this contrasts with the evidence from Ketilat Ajrud, as already said, where you have Asherah, Kerbet el-Kom as well. And this could be supplemented by the 2 standing stones and incense altars at Arad, which may suggest 2 deities there worshipped at different times. The bull, that bull site, and the Tanakh cult stand of Asherah. But even so, the abundant evidence for only one deity, Yahweh, is unique in Israel, and it's not addressed by those who deny any pre-exilic monotheism. So one can therefore see 2 tracks that ancient Israel followed. Some recognized only the God Yahweh and worshipped him alone, This was often the official religion. That it was is suggested by the public face as found in the names and letters between military officials that only use Yahweh. Others worshipped Yahweh along with Asherah, his wife, consort, and other deities such as Baal. The extent to which this expression dominated is difficult to measure, but it seems to have been followed more in the northern kingdom and less publicly in the southern kingdom of Judah. And that's all on the basis of extra-biblical, non-biblical material. So Yahweh of these texts, the Yahweh of these texts and names, supported by the iconography and cult sites that reach into earlier periods, all attest to distinctive roles and views of this deity that diverge from that of adjacent nations and other deities. So yeah, I think without doubt we can argue that there was a distinctive worship of Yahweh. Not only there were people who worshipped other gods and goddesses, including Yahweh among them, but there was a distinctive worship of Yahweh that was found in Israel that is unlike any other chief or state deity in any other culture around the world. Thank you.
Okay, so they're using his name,
Yeah.
but we're not supposed to give any description. So you had the vacant spot in the.
Yeah, that's so, I mean, how do you do that? I mean, that's amazing, I think.
So
But,
that was consistent with Yahweh. Was it consistent that no description could be given?
Right, there isn't in the material. The only place where some people would argue that it was at Kuntilat Ajrud. I showed you those guys. But nobody knows that that's what it is. In fact, I think it's just what they call the best figurines, BES. And these are a couple figurines for good luck. There's no necessary relationship between them and the other markings and the description on there. It's just a lot of material that's written on there. But yeah. And you know what's very interesting too? If you go to the Bible and you look at the descriptions where prophets, like in Isaiah 6 and elsewhere, are brought into the presence of God, and of course the famous one in Exodus 34, where Moses sees the back of Yahweh, which could be translated the traces of Yahweh, you never get what did his face look like. Look at Isaiah 6. I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train, or the edges of his robe, filled the temple. You don't get a description of the face or anything like that. Same way, even in that incredible text of Exodus 24, after the people receive the covenant, and Moses sprinkles the blood on them, and twice they do all these words. Then he invites the representatives of the people up to the top of the mountain, and it says twice there in verses 9 to 11, they saw God, and they ate and drank, which itself is a precursor looking forward to the great banquet. That continues to be a theme, ultimately leads to Revelation, the banquet of the Lamb. But there it says they saw, but it never describes. They only see under his feet the blue of, which I think is the sea now, absolutely calm under his control, and his feet, and they see enough to know that this is God. That's what they see, but they don't. There's no description. It's really significant, and even when you, sorry, I could go on about this for a long time, but even when you come to the Ten Commandments, okay, what does it say? He says, he begins the Ten Commandments, Ani Adonai Eloheka, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Now, every other god and goddess in the ancient world is marked, usually, by some equipment. I showed you that Baal figure, and he has weapons that he fights sea with. And presumably that was in his hand and fell out at some point. But there was some weapon there. They have weapons, or they have jewelry, or they have mirrors, or they have something that they carry with them. That's what's so remarkable. How is the Lord God known? I am the Lord your God. Not by weapons, not by jewelry, not by special clothes. He is known by his historic act of redemption, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. That is how he self-identifies. It is one of the most remarkable texts when you see it that way, in contrast to all the other gods of Moses. Yes.
So you kind of briefly mentioned this, but I'm curious, how much, maybe that's a bad way to phrase this, do we see a lot of extent of the influence of Yahweh post-Israel arriving? Right, so 1200 BC, like how far do we see kind of the worship of Yahweh extend into the surrounding cultures? You kind of mentioned in Canaan, they might, right, they had the bull that maybe this was how they viewed Yahweh, right? And they're making idols of him, even though Israel was commanded not to. Do we see Yahweh like extending far, or does it still stay kind of localized?
I think the ideal was that this is the whole purpose of why God called out Abram to now truly reflect the image of God among the people. The people is the exit. You are a kingdom of priests to represent God to the people and the people to God, but beyond to reach all ends, as he says, to bless all nations of the world. But it doesn't happen, unfortunately. It always remains limited. There is always, just Rahab. Rahab is the great example. It's available. But then in chapter 11, there's only Rahab, that generation. And again and again you see this, that there was hope. You look at Naaman, the Syrian, who confesses. His confession of Yahweh is as strong as any confession in Israel, as is Rahab's. I mean, she is Romans 10:9 in the Old Testament. But there you have these incredible statements of worship of Yahweh, but it never goes very far. It's as though the people